Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the annual lecture of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. My name's Jonathan Montgomery, and I chair the council, and I have the great pleasure of having to do virtually nothing this evening other than to welcome you and our guests to the British Library this evening. Nuffield Council on Bioethics exists to promote and support public discussion and inform policy through identifying and exploring ethical issues arising in the biosciences. And we have a whole range of ways of doing this, but one of them is this annual lecture. I'm delighted to note that at least one of our distinguished previous lecturers is here in the audience, but I'm particularly keen that we get a chance to hear from the main event. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Geoff Watts to the stage, who is a colleague from the Council, science and medical writer and broadcaster. He was a founder member of the Human Genetics Commission. We worked together on the ethics of pandemic influenza, and he chaired our working group on mitochondrial donation. And I'm sure you'll be very interested to hear what he has to say. But I'm particularly pleased to invite our guest of honour to join us, Dr. Amy Gutmann. Dr. Gutmann is here as chair of the US Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. She's also president of Penn, and I suspect that there are some Penn alumni here as well, so we're very pleased to welcome you. She is Christopher H. Browne Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Professor of Communication at the University of Penn. I was scanning something that I'd written in the 1980s a few weeks ago and discovered a long quotation from a piece by Dr. Gutmann on children's rights in education. But more recently, I've come across her excellent work on deliberative democracy. I'm not sure whether we'll hear about children's rights, but I'm sure we'll hear about deliberative democracy during the evening. So can I invite you to welcome Geoff and Amy Gutmann to the stage?
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In the fond expectation the microphone is working and you can hear me, let me add my welcome both to Amy, if I may call you that, and also to you. As Jonathan has said, the format is fairly straightforward. We'll have conversation for 45 minutes, an hour or so, and then it'll be over to you to raise any issue you like, as Amy has told me beforehand. And if you want to ask her something testing, she'll be delighted to have a go at answering it. What I want to do, first of all, is just a little bit more sort of the biographical side of you, so that we can get some sense of how you got from where you started to where you are now. You did your master's here in LSE and then a PhD from Harvard, both in political science. Now, had you at that stage of your career, early stage of your career, formulated exactly where this was going to take you or what you wanted to do, or did you have a completely open agenda at that point?
So first, before I answer, I just want to thank you thank you and Jonathan and everybody for enticing me across the pond. It was not a hard sell, I have to say, and it's a delight to be here and to see both so many familiar faces in the audience and also so many people who are interested in bioethics. So now, the answer is no. I didn't even know what bioethics was when I was studying at the LSE and when I went on to do my PhD. Back in the States, I did a master's at LSE in political sociology, actually, and I studied a lot of history and a lot of political science. I was always interested in issues of justice. Mm-hmm. I was interested in issues of justice from the time I was a child, undoubtedly because of my family. My father had escaped Nazi Germany, had lived in India for 14 years. My mother, had survived and just barely survived the Depression in the United States. So justice was interesting to me from the beginning. But when I was at the LSE in the early 70s, the whole idea of ethics as it's applied to science and medicine hadn't really taken off, even though if you look at the history of medicine, the Hippocratic Oath is at the origins of medicine.
Yes, in those days we were talking about the difference between etiquette and ethics just before this evening began. And I think medicine in those days was still in the position of etiquette rather than ethics. There were things that doctors could and couldn't do, but they were mostly about not getting into bed with your patients, for example, or not making inappropriate referrals. The notion there was something deeper than that was a much more recent realization, wasn't it?
Much more recent, although it wasn't too long after I was at the LSE that bioethics started taking off in the States with the Belmont Commission report in 1978, which was commissioned to look at the topic of the ethics of human subjects research in the wake of the Tuskegee experiments. And I think you probably all know about the Tuskegee experiments, which were, from any perspective, whether medical or ethical, and I really believe they come together, scandalous.
Just for people who don't, this was people who had syphilis, wasn't it? And there was more or less, there was one called a controlled trial. In a sense it was, wasn't it? There was an attempt to see what would happen if you denied them treatment. It
was a group of African American, very poor sharecroppers who the experiments began in 1932 and they continued to 1972. They continued. And about 399, if my memory serves me correct, 399 of those subjects had syphilis, and after penicillin was discovered as an effective treatment for syphilis, none of those people were told either that they had syphilis or that there was a cure for them. The experiments went on. So the Belmont Commission, interestingly, and I remember this vividly, and it caught my attention, they issued a report which was a report about principles. What are the principles that should guide medicine moving forward? And I always thought you should begin with principles. They didn't issue any recommendations about legislation. It was a prescriptive report about what ethical conduct in research is.
Right.
And that was the late 70s. And then it was still a small enterprise at that time, but I signed on pretty early to it and wrote an article in the early 80s, I believe, when I was an assistant professor, called For and Against Equal Access to Healthcare.
You had a succession of academic appointments in the States, Princeton and Harvard and so on, but I mean, how would you in very broad terms characterize your interests over this period? You said justice has been a continuing interest. You'd obviously begun fairly early on to take an interest in ethics of biomedicine as well. But these the main preoccupations, or were there others?
So justice is very big, and it's also very ideal sounding. If you read Plato's Republic, it's about how to create a just society.
Who could be against it?
And who could be against it until you find out, when you read Plato's Republic, that all you have to do, according to Socrates, is you have to banish everybody over the age of 10 to actually create an ideal just society. So that never seemed very practical to me. So I've always been interested in political science and history and sociology. And I did an interdisciplinary major as an undergraduate because I think you have to also be practical. I think ethics is a practical enterprise, so you can begin with principles, but you can't just end there. Otherwise, you're never going to get anything good accomplished with human beings who, all of us we're frail characters. We may be strong, but part of our strength is ethical frailty, right? In other words, if we think the smartest among us suffer from hubris, and that gets us into a lot of trouble, ethical as well as practical, and they come together. So you asked me, how do I get interested in ethics? It's precisely because I think ethics is a practical enterprise, as well as an enterprise that seeks to move us in the direction of a more just society.
One final biographical stage for you. In 2004, was you moved to your present role as president of Penn. Now, this kind of job clearly has satisfactions of its own, but it often seems to me that, don't you find it interfering, or do you find it frustrating that it must eat into the time which hitherto had been devoted to rather more scholarly enterprises? Or do you not see it like that?
I don't. It definitely eats into the time of scholarly enterprises. The biggest challenge for being president of Penn is that there are only, the last I counted, 24 hours in a day and 7 days in a week and 52 weeks in a year, because there's multiple things that can be done in any given time. Even if I just stayed at the University of Pennsylvania, right now, there are, and I don't exaggerate, there are dozens of wonderfully appealing, dozens is not an exaggeration, appealing intellectual events which I would love to be able to be part of. So, but then you ask me, is that frustrating? Well, I think of that as life, and I find it, as president, I can do so much more to enable other people to succeed in their scholarship than I can do as a solitary scholar.
Indeed, that was what I suppose I had in mind when I said it has satisfactions of its own.
But a number of my colleagues who have not taken on administrative positions, I think it should be said, I don't know if it's true for those of you who are academics in the audience, but it should be said that the probably median academic thinks that I and other people who take on administrative roles have gone to the dark side.
Good Lord. Okay, on then to the main reason that you're here, obviously, is the Presidential Commission. Why presidential? I mean, is it an indication of some special standing that it might not have if it was simply called the US National Commission on Bioethics? Does this have certain implications for the way you operate or for the standing you have? It's alien territory to me, this.
Definitely makes a difference that we're a presidential commission in several ways. First, we serve at the pleasure of the President of the United States. And when I was asked to serve, and then when my commission members were asked to serve, the first thing I thought to myself is, I've been asked by the President of the United States to serve, and when you're asked by the President, you should say yes. And I tell my colleagues at Penn that when you're asked by the President to serve, you should say yes. So I like to, walk the walk as well as talk the talk. So that's one way it may. The other way it makes a difference is that the President actually does give us charges, projects. Not everything we do is a presidential charge. We're an independent commission in the sense that we're not a partisan commission, and our work is independent of presidential or congressional oversight. Our work is our own, and I should say everything I say today, I'm speaking not on behalf of the commission. When I speak about the commission, obviously, everything I say, I hope it is to the best of my knowledge accurate, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the commission. I'm speaking in my own voice. But we do serve at the pleasure of the President. We take charges from the President, and all of our reports we speak in our own voice. We do not speak for the administration.
And whether you please the President in the service you do for him will depend on what it is you conclude, presumably. Do you get any kind of feedback?
Since we don't have legislative power, our reports are, they succeed or fail on their ability to persuade and to get out in the public realm. But so far, the charges we've taken from the President, and we've also taken a charge on behalf of the President and the Secretary of Health and Human Services, probably the most challenging, undoubtedly the most challenging report we've done, is a charge to advise the administration on whether children should be tested should be subject to a test for as of now, experimental anthrax vaccine. So in the event of an anthrax attack, there would be a tested vaccine known to be effective. And that report, we were asked to do that report because a federal commission had advised the Secretary of HHS to start testing anthrax on children, and there was a pretty big reaction against that, and there was a strong support for it. It's fair to say everything we've been asked to do has been very controversial. Nothing more controversial than doing a study that combines children, vaccine testing, and anthrax.
Yes, that's a heady combination, isn't it?
And we issued the report, and we got enormous positive feedback from it. And we argued it all out in public, and the report came out with a recommendation that did not fully endorse the previous recommendation. And I think it's fair to say that nobody could have predicted how we would have ended up when we started.
Just a matter of interest, do you ever get feedback from the president himself? Do you ever find out whether he's pleased or dissatisfied with the results?
We do find out, and we get feedback we've gotten feedback from the president, the vice president, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services, all of whom have been very generous in their thanks to us.
That's encouraging as well.
We also get feedback from people who criticize our results.
Yes, I can imagine, yes. And obviously you hope to influence public policy. I mean, to what extent do you feel that your reports are influential in this sense?
So I think it's a big question, how do you measure your influence in public policy terms? And I don't know the full answer to that, but I have some partial answer to it, which I think is important, because I think it's important that we look. So here's a recommendation that we made on the anthrax, testing anthrax vaccine with children. We recommended that the government not simply start testing anthrax vaccine on children because it is not known to be the experiment is not known to be of minimal risk or just a small amount above minimal risk. And we thought it is wrong to treat children as individual children as means to a larger end of the public good, unless it's really minimal risk. But we didn't stop there. We recommended something called age de-escalation. So we know that there's a minimal risk vaccine available for adults. If you test it on the youngest adults, it's known to be minimal risk, see that it's minimal risk for the youngest adults, then you could take the oldest children, have a minimal risk, or slightly above minimal risk, and do age de-escalation. We got enormous positive response to that recommendation. And that's and it was people basically, both sides said that makes sense. It's a way of going forward. So that's one measure when you get the kind of public positive response in both the journals of record, the scientific journals, and in public, from public officials. And there are multiple examples of that in our recommendations.
At the other end of the process, at the beginning of the process, when you're considering what your recommendations would be, I take it, like Nuffield, you go out and look for opinions. You seek as wide a possible diversity of views as you can. Or that is what you do.
We do.
Yeah.
We do. Not only do we seek the widest possible diversity, they come to us even, unsolicited. We do all of our deliberations in public. We have public meetings. I don't know that Nuffield has that. I don't think Nuffield has that
Well, some of them
rule.
are sort of semi-public, but mostly it's not. I mean, there are public meetings, for example, which would inform our debate, but we don't routinely hold, I think, something like a sort of a congressional committee or something like that. We don't do it that way, no.
Our deliberations by law must be in public, and I happily do that. I'm a theorist of deliberative democracy, and we practice it. And we seek the widest range of views internally to come in to us, and we now it's with Bioethics. It's www.bioethics.gov, and people write in and send in, and Nuffield has sent in advice to us on our most recent.
Sure it was most influential too. Can I ask you something that crossed my mind? The influence of organised religion. Now, religious opinion tends to make itself heard much more forcefully on your side of the Atlantic than it does on this side. Does it ever create difficulties for you? Or, as far as you're concerned, is this just another constituency which must be taken account of?
It's a good question, because I don't think of it as organized religion. I think that there are religious views that have strong ethical content to them, and it's the ethical content, not the religion per se, that we pay attention to. Now, they obviously overlap. The ethical views overlap with religious views, but they don't map on to a single, in general, they don't map onto a single religion.
Because what I had in mind was that...
Yeah, so tell me what you have in mind.
The force of religious opinion often expresses itself in America, quite openly, vociferously, demonstrations. I mean, do you ever find your meetings, your hearings are being picketed or anything like that?
We had a meeting just an informal gathering at Vice President Biden's house. He graciously invited to meet with our commission, and there were anti-abortion picketers outside, more, I think, picketing the administration than us, but it was, but we really haven't set anything off. I hope we don't set anything off, but we haven't avoided it either. We have on our commission somebody who is a Catholic priest. We have on our commission people from various religious backgrounds. I don't know the religions of all the members of the commission, and I understand what you see in the U.S., but having been somebody who's written about identity, politics, there's so many parts of identity politics in the United States that religion doesn't actually stand out anymore. Maybe it was once mainly religious, but now every part of our identity gets into some group. And frankly, bioethics has become a global enterprise, not just a national enterprise. So we've heard a lot from groups outside of the United States urging us to take into account the way how we practice science and medicine in the United States affects the rest of the world. And I think that's a point of pride for our commission, that we've really gotten a lot of feedback from not only Nuffield, but bioethics groups all around the world.
So what is the basis of the ethical principles that you seek to follow when advising on an issue? Where do they come from?
Oh, I have them right here in my pocket. So the great thing about ethics is as far back as human beings thought and acted, they were thinking and acting ethically and unethically as well. But ethical principles go as far back as human thought, as we can trace human thought. And I often find it strange when somebody asks me, why do we have to talk about ethics in medicine, for example? You and I were talking about this earlier. Or why do we have to talk about ethics if we have laws, right? And the first thing I like to say is a version of, Molière's Monsieur Jourdain, that even if you don't know it, you've been talking ethics your whole life without realizing it, just as we've been speaking prose our whole life without realizing it. You've been talking ethics your whole life without realizing it. Ethical principles are embedded in everything we do because they're about how we relate to one another. So, for example, our latest report is about how we react to looking forward to how could we prepare better. And this was a report particularly directed towards ourselves, the Americans. How could the US government and Americans prepare better for the next public health emergency like the Ebola epidemic, right? And if anything you look at that was controversial in the Ebola epidemic, pick out the quarantine of healthcare workers, asymptomatic healthcare workers. You could say, well, the problem with quarantining asymptomatic healthcare workers for Ebola is there's no scientific basis for the quarantine, because if you're asymptomatic, you can't be contagious, right? And that, you may think that that's just a scientific fact and you don't need ethics to determine that. But that's just not correct, because you can say, well, it's not scientifically necessary, but the public is afraid, and you should just quarantine people to get the public not to be afraid. And then you have to start analyzing, well, why isn't that enough? And before you know it, you're balancing how do you react on the one hand to public fear, and on the other hand to the fact that you're unnecessarily restricting the freedom of the people who are doing the most to help contain the Ebola epidemic. That's an ethical problem and a practical problem. And most ethical problems that are worth our consideration are also practical problems.
As you said just now, you haven't actually got your code of ethics in your pocket with you this evening, but in a sense, I mean, the conclusions that you...
Oh, I can give it to you, though.
No, please don't. The conclusions that you come to are in most ways, I suppose, simply a reflection of the best of the nature of the society in which you live. If you lived not in a liberal, tolerant society, but in a totalitarian society, you would reach very different conclusions, wouldn't you? So what you do is an emergent property of the consensus view in your society.
We could not function as well as we can as a commission in an intolerant society. We wouldn't be created. However, I am not a relativist, morally speaking, in this regard. I think ethical principles cross boundaries. That is, I think the ethical principle of toleration applies to tolerant societies and intolerant societies. How you can move it forward is a different issue. So let's start with some basic ethical principles, because that was our first report. Our first report, most unlikely topic. We would not have chosen it. It was a charge because Craig Venter basically did something that was coined creating life. Went all over the media. Craig Venter creates life. And we were asked to speak in a report about what should the principles be for dealing with synthetic biology moving forward. Creating life by engineering. Well, P.S., he didn't create life. He didn't take something that was not living and create life out of it, but it was very hard to get beyond the media this way. But the way we got beyond it was to begin with basic principles. So our basic principles, which we have a consensus on our commission about, and they hark back, they're not Plato's Republic, they're just principles that you can run with and defend as a society. We can, whether we're in Great Britain or the United States. We believe in these principles. And they begin with public beneficence, try to maximize the public good, and minimize harm, but that's not enough. Secondly, responsible stewardship. Be good caretakers of the rights and interests of people and generations that can't speak for themselves in a democracy. Third, intellectual freedom and responsibility. And that's very important in the progress of science. We don't want to unnecessarily restrict the progress of science, but scientists and we also have a responsibility for abiding by the other principles. Fourth, democratic deliberation, which is you really have to deliberate these principles in public and have them stand the test of time and be revised over time. And fifth is the overarching principle of justice and fairness, which brings in respect for persons. And that isn't a formula, but it's a set of principles that can guide us forward.
And it's
so I do have it in my pocket.
Yeah, yes,
I even bring it here. I write it down just in case I forget. I don't want to have a Rick Perry moment when I say there are 5 principles and I can't remember the 5th. But I remembered them. So there you go.
So in that sense, I mean, this is a set of principles that works
I don't
well.
know if all of you know Rick Perry, but I don't know him personally either, and I apologize to take his name in vain, but it's irresistible.
We get the point over here. It happens too. English politicians are, you know. Anyway, coming back
It happens to all of us, actually. Not all of us run for president, though, and have it happen to us.
Yes, I may be losing my thread now, too.
Yeah, I could easily.
It so happens, I mean, the set of principles that you've outlined work well in the kind of liberal, tolerant society such as you have in the States and we have here. What you're suggesting is if that in the unlikely event that a body such as yours was created in a totalitarian society, it should presumably come out with the same set of principles. It's just they wouldn't be very popular in the society in which they'd set this up.
You just nailed it. Yeah. I couldn't say it better, and I would just extend what you said. It's not impossible. It's very improbable that we would be created, but this is a very philosophical moment. Have the thought experiment. Were we created in a far less tolerant society than the US or Great Britain? And mind you, we're not perfectly tolerant societies, but far less tolerant societies. Societies that don't have, in the case of the US, a Bill of Rights, or in the case of Great Britain, a tradition of and laws that defend tolerance. We would still, we as a commission, individuals would still come out with the same reports and the same recommendations. They would fall on different and perhaps deafer ears.
Yeah, yeah.
And by the way, the ears that all of our reports fall on, just as our voices and are imperfect, so are the ears. But that's why I said we're frail human beings. We do the best we can, but if we don't start addressing issues like should you test anthrax vaccine on children, how should you deal with, how should you maximize preparedness for the next public health emergency? What are our rights to privacy when we get our whole genomes tested? If you don't begin with ethical principles, I submit you can't move forward. You simply cannot move forward.
Say a little bit more about deliberative democracy. Jonathan mentioned it at the beginning. You mentioned it in passing just now. I know this is a particular interest of yours, but maybe I don't know whether everyone uses it in the same sense. So what do you mean by the term? So
deliberation goes back before democracy. It actually, the origin of the word is when a head of state asks for good counsel. And it's the give and take. Democratic deliberation, however, is different from that. It resembles it, and it's a give and take of argument for the sake of making a decision. Democratic deliberation is the give and take of argument among free and equal citizens for the sake of making decisions. It's not just discussion, as we are discussing here or we do in a seminar room. It's actually, in order to deliberate effectively, you have to issue a decision. It doesn't have to be a legislative decision, but it has to be an action-guiding decision. In other words, you have to have a give and take of argument. You get as many opinions as you can process and as exist together. You argue them out, and you issue an opinion, an action-guiding opinion. And the great thing about democratic deliberation, and here it's as much democratic as deliberation, as your decisions can always be revisited, and they should be revisited over time. It's iterative. So that's democratic deliberation.
How far does that inform the way that your commission operates?
I think our commission has embraced this in practice even before we embraced it in theory. I obviously embraced it in theory prior to being the chair of the commission, but we began by practicing it. And it really has made a difference in both how we came together as a commission and in our reports.
So it's a sort of an emergent property of the way you operate. You suddenly realize, my God, we're practicing deliberative democracy.
Exactly. It is a little bit like that.
Well, that's the ideal state of
affairs. And the Belmont report doesn't have as one of its principles deliberation, but it practiced democratic deliberation. And that's one of the reasons that report became so deeply ingrained in U.S. bioethics culture, because it actually practiced democratic deliberation, and we're the beneficiaries of that, and we've made it explicit that this is a very important principle of the way a large, diverse democracy can actually make progress on the thorniest, most controversial issues that are at the intersection of ethics and medicine, ethics and science, ethics and technology.
Right. Well, what about your current work? What's going on at the moment? What issues are you looking at?
So our most recent report was on how to prepare for public health emergencies like the the next Ebola epidemic. And the second set of reports that we're doing, we've issued one and the other one is out imminently, is on brain science, on the ethics of neuroscience and the implications of the findings of neuroscience for ethics in the courtroom and consent, the ability of people to consent to research, and a whole set of issues.
What stage is that at then?
That we're almost complete with that.
Because this is territory that the Nuffield Council has reported, as you're well aware. Do you think you're going to be coming to broadly similar conclusions?
Well, we'll have to see. I can't...
no hints then.
But we actually got very good advice. I will venture to say we were... The advice that the Nuffield Council gave us was very welcome. One of the things that two comments that I think are you would be interested in, and so deliberative democracy, it attempts in some way to elevate debate by being inclusive and also getting conclusions that are as acceptable as possible and being respectful of disagreement. So we're trying in the commission to be very accessible in our reports, but to avoid hype. And we've made a recommendation in neuroscience in particular that scientists and the media alike should try to avoid the hype that either gets people to think that once we map the human brain, we will know everything about human behavior, we could predict it, or the fear that people have of, oh my gosh, the government's going to be bugging our brains. So we recommend it against hype. So we issued the Ebola report, which is, if I may say so, it's careful, it's not hype, And Popular Science magazine runs, the body of the story is very accurate, but the headline of the Popular Science story is, Americans were unscientific jerks about the Ebola outbreak. That was their headline for our report. Americans were unscientific jerks about the Ebola outbreak. I can assure you there was nowhere we said that. We were critical about some public officials who quickly started the bandwagon of quarantine, but there's only so much you can do to avoid.
There wasn't a transient flash of envy thinking, if only we could have said that.
Not really. Not that. We wouldn't have said it that way. I mean, we would have been more specific.
You mentioned the hype around brain science, and that obviously was one of the factors, I think, that influenced Nuffield to the Emerging Neurotechnologies report, because I think a lot of people inside neuroscience were becoming increasingly concerned that people on the outside were beginning to think that we were on the verge of understanding the whole lot. Somehow that it does give you an illusion of understanding if you scan someone's brain and see one particular part of the brain light up when they're having one particular set of thoughts. And you begin to think you're understanding. What you're understanding is really not very much at all. And yet, somehow, the people are beginning to get, as you say, this hyped-up vision of what it is that scientists are achieving.
Right. So the New York Times Magazine wrote a story with these call-outs that basically suggested, if you read the whole story, they took it back. But again, the headlines suggested, once we map the human brain, we will know who we are. I mean, and so it'll be a form of secular immortality. And then you just have to recreate the circuitry, and you have the whole person of
Bingo.
who you, Geoff, are.
Just like that.
Bingo. But there are some really serious practical issues involved here on the way, you can, through fMRIs, light up brain images and show indications that there's brain damage or not brain damage in a person. So let me give you an example that our report will say something about. There's a 2005 US Supreme Court decision that says that you cannot hold, and this is very specific to the US, you'll see why in a moment because it's about capital punishment. So a 2005 Supreme Court decision says you cannot hold juveniles, you cannot inflict the death penalty on juvenile offenders because they have their brains are too immature. So the death penalty is legal in the U.S., but it is not, by the latest Supreme Court decision, legal for juveniles. So an adult, imagine an adult, and you don't have to, there are cases coming forward like this, an adult who a neuroscientist can show with physical evidence of lighting up how the brain lights up, that there is brain damage that renders that adult's brain less mature than a juvenile brain, and through no fault of the adult. The adult didn't do it to himself. Okay, if you bring that to trial, should that adult be exempted from the death penalty? Now, you have to put aside whether you're for or against. Obviously, if you're against the death penalty, you'll take anything to get anyone off of the death penalty. But given that the death penalty is legal in a court of law in the US, neuroscience really does bring up some challenge. That's just one of many, many examples. It raises some challenging questions about how law functions. And one can say, as a good lawyer and a good legal scholar could say, it should make no difference. This is what the law is, and it's juveniles by age is what the Supreme Court decision rendered. It said it was because the brain was immature, but that was only part of it. There's a break-off by age. But when you get this kind of neuroscience evidence, it does necessarily raise in your mind, okay, what happens when we know more than we know now about how responsible people are for their ability to think about right and wrong and do and act according to right and wrong. Yeah.
I don't think anytime soon biomedicine is likely to be running out of issues to consider. But is there anything particularly that you would like your commission to look at in the near future, something which you think really has to be tackled?
So in the part of the Ebola report, which is our latest report, and every other report we've done, issues about how public health in other countries affects everybody in the world. That seems to me more and more just an issue of, if you will, almost crisis proportions. That is, whether it's in our own society, the US, this isn't as true in Great Britain because of your health system, but in our own society, there are people still who don't have basic health care. Or around the world, most recently it was Liberia, Guinea and Sierra Leone, where the infrastructure, the healthcare infrastructure and the poverty in a society is so great that all you need is the kind of infection that happened in Ebola, and it becomes a world crisis. I think how we deal with justice across borders, bioethics across borders, is, to me, one of the most important and challenging issues. And I don't think we as a commission could do it all, but I think we're starting to do some of that. And I think it's very important because germs don't know national boundaries.
Indeed,
and justice, there's a challenge about justice. How much more do we owe people close to us, our own fellow citizens, than we owe human beings who have rights and are deserving of respect who are not in our country, and how that intersects with what's practically possible in our politics. That's the issue that I'm speaking for myself now, but that both fascinates me, intrigues me, and it also worries me that our national politics sometimes it's like a bandwagon effect of rallying around our what's conceived to be our national self-interest, and it actually isn't. It's actually against our national self-interest to be selfish.
Yeah. I mean, before we move to questions from the audience, let me raise just one more issue, a bit of a hobby horse of mine. As Jonathan said earlier on, I chaired the working party that looked at mitochondrial DNA. Mm-hmm. And of course, we decided that mitochondrial donation was ethically acceptable, and went out of our way to make it absolutely clear this in no sense was any kind of green light for wider germline gene therapy. But that is obviously on the horizon. It's coming along. I mean, there was a report, I think, just this week in the press that some people in your country have been investigating this more with more enthusiasm than has gone on hitherto. And it does seem to me that sooner or later this is something that we're going to have to tackle, and it should really be done sooner rather than later, on the grounds that if people start doing this in back rooms and cupboards and out-of-the-way places, it's going to be all the worse for us, and if we haven't actually considered it ourselves. Has your commission contemplated looking at this at all, or has it been suggested to you? Or?
So there's been a lot of the previous commission's reports have focused on issues of genomics and DNA. So we don't want to go over the well-trod territory, but I do actually, I read your report and I commend it for actually, among other pieces of advice, indicating that if you have donor input, it doesn't create another parent out of, in creating a child. I know for you that may be frustrating. That's the main thing that was focused on, but it was a big deal, I think, to get that very clearly out there.
But the trouble is, inevitably, it was greeted with the usual slippery slope arguments. They've said that this particular form of very limited, very circumscribed, very narrowly defined germline gene therapy is acceptable. Therefore, tomorrow they'll be wanting to do the whole rest, all the nuclear DNA, the whole shebang. And we were at pains to point out that that was not our wish, not our intention. It's a big, huge discussion for another day. But it has to be held, doesn't it? Because sooner or later, someone is going to say, look, the technology has reached the point where it's safe to try this in humans. What about it? We can cure this inherited disease, cure that. The sooner we look at it, the better, presumably.
So the sooner we look at the ethics of neuroscience research, the ethics of DNA research, and so on, the better. There's just no doubt about it. And it's not because science will just plow forward regardless. It's because science and ethics go together, and scientists want to do things that actually are done ethically and that help people live better lives. And we might as well figure out how to do that early on, whether we're doing genomics research or brain science. And that's something that we have, as a commission, really harped on, which is the frustration that it takes a crisis to focus the mind of society. So you needed an Ebola epidemic to focus the mind on public health emergencies, and we haven't funded the WHO is poorly funded to deal with public health emergencies. They're disorganized in ways that we've recommended to repair. The U.S.'s contribution has gone down. It takes a crisis to get people focused on it, and it shouldn't. But we really do need to act proactively for.
Because the implications are awesome for some of these, the ideas that the science comes up with, and if you haven't thought about that in advance, it's so much the worse for you. Right, okay, at this point, let's head open to the audience. We've got a couple of microphones down here at the front. So if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment or challenge something that Amy has said, I'm sure she'll be delighted
or something that Geoff has said.
Or something I don't know about that. And if you could say who you are before you ask your question. Right, can I have some hands up there? But my old friend Browne there.
Yeah, please identify yourself.
You're...
Yes, Browne, Imperial College and the Institute of Medical Ethics. Hello. Lovely talk, or discussions, if I may say so, and I love the idea of bioethics sans frontières that you are advocating. I'm interested to know why your principles don't include a principle of respect for autonomy.
So all of the principle of public beneficence, the principle of responsible stewardship, and the principle of justice and fairness all implicate respect for persons. And all of our reports have taken that seriously. Remember, these are high-level principles that have sub-principles to them. So they do, in effect, have respect for persons. And explicitly, intellectual freedom and responsibility is incomprehensible without the idea of our being autonomous, self-generating, self-thinking people.
Can I just follow that up?
Is it by any chance the fact you don't mention autonomy explicitly because so widely it's misinterpreted to mean I want it, therefore I must have it?
You've pinned it down, absolutely. We, as a public, I think it's really important when you serve on a public commission, if the public commission's purpose includes issuing reports that don't simply preach to the converted, but get people of who have different comprehensive philosophies to actually think together for practical ethical purposes. It's very important not to use terms that are unduly either controversial in themselves, bring a lot of controversial baggage with them, or are terms of academic art. And autonomy happens to be whatever you think of the first, it's certainly the last. It's a term of academic art. I've never been in a dinner conversation with non-academics where someone says, you're not respecting my autonomy. I mean, I've been there when you say you're not being fair, you're not respecting me as a person, but nobody except people who have been educated in the philosophy, including myself. I mean, I'm a defender of autonomy for people. I think anyone who's read my work knows that. But as a commission, we're much more effective when we don't use terms of art.
Oh, now we know what kind of dinner parties Ra Gillen goes to. Okay, the hand over here, in the middle row there.
So if you think a dinner party is really not interesting if it doesn't talk about autonomy, count me out, right?
Hi, my name is Sarah Legrand. I was hoping you could expand a little bit on two things. One thing I'm really interested in is how you manage dissent within the Commission itself, whether you publish a kind of a dissenting opinion in the way the Supreme Court does, or whether you manage that differently. And the other thing I was hoping you could expand on is a little bit the what you were talking about, your work on sort of neuroscience and criminal justice, and how you're able. Sorry.
No, I'm just writing it down so I
Okay.
can. I don't forget the first one. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, how work like yours is able to feed into the legal system and say, well, actually, this law is based on antiquated notions
Feed
of
into the
human
political
behavior.
system, you said there.
Feed into the legal system.
Yeah.
Right.
To what extent
Yeah.
you're able to have influence there.
Good.
Okay, dissent, first of all, I'm sure you don't have any dissent, do you? I mean, don't they all
So
agree with you?
here's how we would handle dissent the way previous commissions have, which is we would publish a dissenting opinion or opinions. But we've issued 8 reports and we have not had any dissenting opinions. And that's not because we agree on everything, because we're a very diverse commission. We come from diverse backgrounds, perspectives, you name it, religions, disciplines, you name it. For 10 people, we're quite diverse. We have not had a dissenting opinion, and one reason for it is I think we've done really excellent deliberation, if I may say so, and I commend the commission for that. They're just really taking it to heart. But the other reason, which is probably equally important, is that we have said as a commission that if we're going to make recommendations for practical purposes, we should strive to come to agreement if we can. And so we've happened to been able to come to agreement, and we're pleased and rather proud of that, and I'm very proud of the commission for that. But I don't know, the next report, there could be a dissenting opinion. But we deliberate in public, and if you were at the meetings, or you can actually get them on their web, they're archived in webcasts. If you were at the meetings on the anthrax vaccine, you would have heard a lot of back and forth among commission members, not just among the participants, but in commission members. And we actually hashed it out and came to a consensus. And so that's the first question.
And that was feeding into was it the political or the legal system?
So neuroscience, totally different, how neuroscience feeds into the legal system. So we're about to publish a report which will address this, but I'll tell you how we've already had a public meeting on this. So the conclusion we came to as a commission is that there are many neuroscience findings that have the ability of clarifying what the capacity of human beings is, and how we should understand the human brain and how it relates to human action, but no neuroscience findings in itself, and I could say this more broadly, science in itself cannot tell us what the law should do. The should also requires us to bring something more than just scientific facts to bear. So let me give you the strongest example of that, and this isn't in the report. This is just me speaking. Even if we find out through science that a human brain is damaged in some way or incapable in some way of not doing a violent act, that in itself cannot tell us, without a moral should here, what the punishment should or shouldn't be. Now, it can inform the moral should. So I'm not saying I'm saying that it's very relevant to our moral thinking, but by itself, we still need an ethical principle to get us over. If the goal line is what the law should be and how the law should treat people, to get over that goal line, we need we need ethics.
Yes, in another context, I think Churchill said science should be on tap but not on top, and it's the same
Science
kind of thing.
should be on tap but not on top.
Right,
So
yes.
justice is on top. My view is that justice is the regulator of what we should do. And it's almost by definition that.
Yes. One from a commission member there, and then the next one down here.
Thank you. Roland Jackson, member of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and also Executive Chair of ScienceWise, which is a body that fosters deliberative engagement across UK government on issues around science and technology. So my question's about deliberative discussion. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to unpick a little more about what you mean by that and how you practice it. Do you mean deliberative discussion in front of the public, or do you mean deliberative discussion with publics as a part of your process of coming to reports? And if so, how does that process operate?
Okay, we mean both. We deliberate in front of the public, and we deliberate with the public. So we take questions from the public and reply to them. We do that at meetings when there are questions live. We also, when we don't have time at meetings, we get back to the public with our responses, and those responses are public as well. So we do both.
Thank you. I'm a consultant physician. The comment about religion and ethics, as I understood, you thought there are more generic ethical problems rather than particularly related to religion. That's how I understood it. Perhaps an example of, say, blood production and religious belief. If we don't take that into account, how you practically sort of go about it may be difficult. Is that?
So. We do take religious beliefs into account. I think it's really important to unpack religious beliefs. And what I mean is to not simply say, oh, those beliefs are Jewish or Catholic or Muslim or Buddhist, and stop there. I think we need every religious tradition, all of those religious traditions, and every religious tradition has a tradition of discussion and reasoning and so on. So that's what I was speaking to. I think it is very important for us to respect individuals who have ethical views that are rooted in their, I think this is what that are rooted in their religions. I mean, and I dare say some of my, if not all of my ethical views are probably traceable in some sense to my religious upbringing. I was brought up in the Jewish tradition, and I actually had my first organized education in ethics was in what I called as a kid Hebrew school, where I learned about ethics, and it wasn't taught in public school, and we didn't talk about that, but I think that's a shame that ethics wasn't taught explicitly in public schools. So I think, going back to your question, that it's really important to respect the ethical traditions that come out of religious traditions, but it's equally important not to assume that just because somebody is an X and you fill in the religion, that they necessarily have Y ethical view, because every major religion, every religion that I know of, has internal dissent within it, and we should respect that as well. And that's the key to a tolerant society. The key to a tolerant society is respecting dissenting views, whether they're outside or inside a religious tradition. And it's just as hard for some religious traditions, and sometimes even harder for religious traditions to respect dissent within them than it is to respect dissent outside of them. So thank you for that opportunity to clarify. I think it's really important.
Eileen O'Keefe, London Metropolitan University. I wonder how broad your questions can be about questions of the social organization of science. And I'm thinking particularly about the kind of charge that the president can give you on the Brain Research Initiative. I note that there are 5 federal organizations that are being funded by government to take part in the initiative, and they include DARPA, which is a defense-related advanced research initiative, and also IARPA, which is involved with intelligence research, which directly relates to the Department of Intelligence in the United States. And what I wonder is how far you're in a position to question the appropriateness of the range of questioning that can take place within the organizations that are part of the, as it were, the terms of reference of the charges that you're given. I note that DARPA has already agreed that they will have 6 ethicists who are independent, who will be part of their decision-making activities. But I do wonder when our scientists work for the Defense Department and are giving out the contracts or the intelligence services, what kind of questioning you can do about that?
So one of the first recommendations we made after we deliberated on neuroscience, being charged by the president to talk about the ethics of neuroscience research and the ethical implications of neuroscience findings. We had both those charges. One of the first recommendations we made is to proactively integrate people whose expertise was ethics in every large neuroscience enterprise, and that including DARPA and IARPA. And to the government's credit, they did that. And the bodies moving forward include people whose charge and mission is to investigate and speak internally about the ethical issues. Now, I can't speak for whether there are some, when there's classified work going on. We are not a legislative body. So we can't, and we wouldn't do this for any agency. We don't swoop in to Health and Human Services or any agency, you name it, or the Food and Drug Administration. We don't swoop in and give legislative dicta. But we did strongly recommend that every large enterprise that moves forward with brain research include the voice of ethicists.
Hi, I'm David Ellerman, a paediatrician with a particular interest in public health. I admired and agreed with your report on newborn screening, but I'm not convinced that much notice was taken of it, unfortunately, in the States. But my question is a topical one. At the moment, there's a relative increase in the amount of measles in the States, where you have sort of compulsion, not absolute, but sort of. And this is an example where if you like, the rights of the parent, of the individual child, not to immunise them, may conflict with the rights of the rest of the population, who are therefore exposed to a potentially dangerous illness. And is that a topic you would take on?
So our Ebola report addresses this not by looking explicitly in detail at the measles, but it actually does indicate how important it is to go disease by disease and see what is necessary to protect human beings, in this case, children. And it is widely recognized that we need what's called herd immunity to protect children from the measles. And I'll just speak, now as somebody who's studied this. It is striking in the United States how much close to fear verging on panic there was about the Ebola epidemic, and yet many more people will predictably die of the flu in any flu season in the United States, many of them who haven't gotten vaccinated. Now, flu vaccine doesn't protect against every form, but the measles is another example, totally different from Ebola in being much more contagious than Ebola. Measles are contagious, as a lot of you probably know, when you're not symptomatic. So we don't have time right now to take that up, the measles, but I don't think it's, despite what the press, some of the press may suggest, I don't think there are two scientific and two ethical balanced views here. I think it is necessary to immunize children against the measles for the sake of their well-being.
You used to have that, or maybe still
You
do.
can exempt for public health purposes. There is a certain percentage. This is where science and ethics have to come together. You have to do both together. There's a certain percentage which scientists can tell you based on research in a particular disease. There's a certain percentage of the population that needs to be vaccinated to have herd immunity. So there is a small percentage of people who could be exempt in any case and not threaten the public health. But in the case of measles, as we've seen, we had states in the United States which had lax laws that were far too lax to prevent innocent children from being subject to what can be life-threatening illness.
But didn't you have a sort of quasi form of compulsion with registration for school? You couldn't go to school unless you...
There are some states.
Well, that's a state by state.
So it's state by state in the United
right.
States. You have to understand here we have a federal system of government, and there's great autonomy for states in the case of measles vaccines. So there's some states, and you would not guess which ones they were, which have close to 100% vaccination rates. Mississippi, for example, Alabama, a lot of our southern states, and some more affluent pockets of American population. Some of the western states, California and Colorado, I believe, had very lax enforcement of this, and that's where the measles, spread. So it is not correlated in this case with income. That was the higher income bracket states that had lower, and areas that had lower immunization. It's absolutely fascinating from this perspective of a political scientist. It's heartbreaking from the perspective of how you can have good science and good ethics, know in this case what the best way forward is, have it institutionalized, and then just people weren't paying attention to the risks, and measles just spread tremendously in the US. And nobody in the US who had not been a healthcare worker contracted Ebola?
Kyle Edwards. I'm a PhD student at Oxford's Ethos Center. Yeah, it's Kyle. You were talking earlier about the US culture of bioethics, and I was wondering if maybe both of you could comment on the sort of comparison, I guess, between the UK and the US bioethics cultures, particularly in light of the recent mitochondrial transfer debate. I think there's a lot of talk around that about the US perhaps developing a body similar to the HFEA, which we obviously don't have. It seems like we've diverged quite a bit, the UK and the US, in respect of assisted reproductive technologies. So yeah, I'm just wondering if you think that the US is headed in that direction towards having a body that regulates that, and if it should, that sort of thing.
Because there's a lot of things you can do in the States in this respect.
So assisted reproductive technology is a great example. And there are many examples. We just talked about vaccines. That's another example. But let's use your example. Assisted reproductive technologies are regulated state by state in the United States. New York State issued a report a long time ago about the ethics of assisted reproduction and surrogacy, for example, and what the law is that regulates the ability to have a surrogate mother, for example, is there 50 different jurisdictions in the United States that regulate that. You can imagine what that means. It is several lifetimes' work for legal ethicists to unwrap. There are cases that come forward. There's a California case, which you couldn't make it up. If you made it up, people would say that's ridiculous. You know, figuring out through divorce and so on who the parent is and who gets child custody and things like that. So that is different from England. So I just wanted to start out with the
Is there no federal law in this particular at all?
Well, I don't want to say there's no law at all. I can't think of one offhand, but there's the Interstate Commerce Clause, which does regulate how states have to recognize other state laws. So with regard to gay marriage, for example, which is a big live issue in the United States, the Supreme Court has said that states need to recognize gay marriage across boundaries, although that's a gross generalization. It's much more complicated than that. But it has yet to say whether it will recognize the right to gay marriage against a state law that prohibits it. And that's up and coming. But that's welcome to the way the U.S. and some things. It's not true for everything. I mean, our Constitution does give some powers to the federal government that override state jurisdictions, clearly, explicitly. But a lot of it is implied and built up, which you can understand since you have an unwritten Constitution built up over case law. And federalism is a very contested territory in the U.S. So I'll just say one other thing. That is very relevant to bioethics. One of the recommendations that we've made pretty consistently in our reports is for there to be some federal standards in some cases where there can be federal standards. So federal standards about privacy protections, for example. We think it would be good to have federal standards to compensate people who are harmed during, research, experimental research. We're the only country that I know of, the only democracy that I know of that doesn't require any kind of, at the federal level, any kind of compensation if you're harmed in research. So I'll turn it over to you, Geoff.
The virtue of a federal system, I suppose, is that it does give the opportunity to, as it were, pioneers to do things that others, and the opportunity for others to learn from the experiences, good or ill, of the pioneers. So.
Absolutely. I mean, I think when something is not established as clearly, ethically, and practically correct, the federal system is actually quite glorious in that there are natural experiments that go on. Now, they're not controlled. They're far from controlled experiments. They're the opposite of controlled experiments. But you can't do very many controlled experiments at that level.
Yeah.
And that is one of the glories of the federal system. But when something like a measles vaccine is known to be effective, and there are clear ethical standards with the right exemptions in place at the extremes, and you have to do it in 50 different states, that can be challenging, let's say.
Indeed.
So, Geoff, you should say, what's your... I don't want to let you off the hook. You had the challenge. You can put him on the hook now.
No, I think in that respect, I mean, I think the federal system has got a lot going for it. I mean, I think, for example, I mean, if you take death and dying, the Oregon sort of experiments, it's an opportunity for not just the rest of the states, the rest of the world, to see how one group of people have decided to seize the issue by the horns and really do something quite dramatic with it.
Yeah, no.
The legalization of drugs, a whole variety of things where the prospects of committing a whole country to it are rather nerve-inducing. Whereas if one state can manage to get it out together.
So I just want to end on a note of what I call heated agreement, because not only is that true, but be careful what you wish for as ethicists when you think you know the right answer and you want, in the case of the United States, the federal government to legislate it. Look at our Congress, and what are the odds that it's going to legislate anything in the near future? So there you go. We agree.
Thank you
lovely. So much.
Thank you too much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Over to you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much, Geoff and Amy. Mine is at the end to draw attention to the distinction you made in the Ebola report between ethical justifications and prudential ones. And I think you've just said that it might be prudential not to trust anything near a legislator. I think there's a very good ethical justification for bringing these proceedings to a close, because you've more than honoured your commitment to us and justified the invitation, I think, to have you come and talk to us about these challenging issues.